All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So I wasn't going to say take a seat, but you're all sitting. Look at that. So I have the privilege of introducing our guest facilitators today. Our first guest facilitator I will introduce is Ashley Northington. Ashley comes to us from R.W. Jones, and R.W. Jones is a strategic communications firm. And in her work, she's also the chair of the HBCU Success Commission, and certainly works with colleges and universities across the nation, not only around EDI, but very specifically around crisis communication and when they're not in crisis, communication in general, and has been a great friend and partner in developing our vision and strategy with equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm very happy to have Ashley. We've only met virtually, so you know how fun it is these days when you meet somebody you feel like you've known for a long time in 3D and get to give them a hug. Our second facilitator comes to us today from the University of Denver. It is always a privilege to have a counterpart such as mine to share in the vision and the work with the university, to know that we don't do this work alone. What we face at our universities is we face nationally. And so someone who can come in, step in, and help guide the work that we've been doing and keep in that alignment. And so Dr. Chris Witt is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Denver. He was the inaugural Vice President, correct? Or there's a lot of vices here. Vice Provost at Creighton University. And so, I think a number of us have made our way somehow through the University of Denver here, who are here in this room, through University of Denver into here. So we know that the work that he does at the University of Denver is crucial both to their mission to serve the public good and to ensure that DEI is weaved through the fabric of their community. So I want to say thank you both for sharing your day with us, and if we could give them a warm welcome from the University of Utah today.
Did you want to say anything? All right. Good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone. I would say that, I'm very impressed with, this day, with the commitments that you all are making to this work. And I'm impressed, as a colleague coming from the University of Denver, somebody who's leading the work at a university on the other side of the mountains, but also as a member of the board of directors for the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed. We just finished our annual meeting in San Diego, so I was able to fly back to Denver, then come here. So if I get a little tired, forgive me. But, really thinking about this work on a national level, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really undergirding that with justice, is so important. And the focus that you all have on equity, the focus that you have to take the time to really have, a whole set of sessions focused on anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, that's powerful. Because, we have corners of our sector, when we think about higher education, where people are scared to mention race, racism, whiteness, blackness, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, any of these, buzz terms that, wait a minute, slow down, what are we doing here? And if we can't mention them in spaces where we create knowledge, then how do we expect anyone in higher education or beyond higher education to overcome the challenges, the obstacles, and the barriers that are inherent to those issues? So once again, like I said, I'm impressed. I thank you all for this opportunity to engage. I'm thinking I might learn as much or more from being here with you all than what I hope to share with you. My roots are that of a political science professor, so I spent lots of years as a political science professor, chair of a political science department, doing kind of a hybrid of that and DEI work. So this is a day where I get to put my teacher hat back on. So they were able to equip me with a lapel mic, so I'll be able to step away and walk amongst the crowd a little bit from time to time. But being a political scientist, I really look at the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion from positions of power dynamics, from structures and systems, and really think, include the one-on-one, include the relationships, but know that things can be really hollow if we only think of the one-to-one and we don't think of the overarching structures and systems and the power dynamics, lived experiences, and perspectives that those individuals bring into the whole. So that's just a little bit about me. We can get started. I will pass the mic to Ashley just for a moment so she can explain the colorful cards that are on your tables, and then I'll jump back in and we'll kind of go through presenting. So,
wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to be talking about a lot of systems and structures happening here in the University of Utah. And so as we go along today, you'll see two bowls on your tables. You can designate one bowl the keep bowl and one bowl the throwaway bowl. And so as we are working through the sessions today, I'll be walking around as Chris is guiding us. We'll think about the things, the systems, the structures, the policies, the programs, the things that we want to keep. We'll jot them down on a postcard, fold them up, put them in the keep bowl. The things that we want to get rid of or dismantle or throw away, we'll jot those down on the postcard and put that in the throwaway bowl. And so we'll bring those up at a different time. We'll share out the things that we want to keep, and then at a certain time, we'll share out the things that we want to dismantle, change, disrupt, or throw away. So again, we'll let Chris take it away. I'll jump in as needed. I'll be walking around to make sure that everyone understands the instructions, everyone is on step with what we're doing, okay? So remember, there's a keep bowl, throwaway bowl. As we're working through, jot down those things we want to keep, jot down those things we want to disrupt or dismantle or change.
thank you. And everyone also should have two handouts front and back, and I know that some people can only be at the afternoon session or only be at the morning session. So those questions is kind of like I said, put my teacher hat on, giving you just something to think about. As we make our way through the presentations today, there'll be some spaces that really connect directly to those questions. Other times they'll be a little bit more abstract, but just a space for you to jot some notes of something for you to take away. You don't have to turn this in or anything. And I purposely kind of labeled it with my name on it so you could have a little bit of a disconnect between what we're presenting here and everything that's done. I think that they mesh together well, but I also want to allow the ability for Marianne and everybody to remind folks, well, this is what we do at the University of Utah. What Dr. Witt said was cool, but this is how we do it at the University of Utah. So, having a little bit of respect for the process there. So for the morning session, we have the sessions 1 and 2 sheet, and you'll see as we go through, you'll see some connection there. And then in the afternoon session, if you can't make it, you already have the sheet, so you can have a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about. You'll see that we have these posted easel boards around the edges of the room, and I believe there might be an opportunity for folks online. If not, if it's on Zoom, maybe they could put something in the chat. But the reason for these posted easels around the room is there'll be a couple of times during the presentation where we'll kind of take a break. And not really, it's gonna be a working break though. It's gonna be where we're gonna ask you to document some things. So I'll ask you something, hey, think about X, Y, Z, and let's make sure that we get it on those Post-its so then we can put it along the glass. So then, by the time we're finished, people could kind of take a walk and see some of the best thoughts that have come from members of the University of Utah community. And also that can be kept for the team here to be able to have an archive of some of the best things that were talked about and thought about, in addition to whatever recording we have for the various discussions that we have. So in that time, you'll have time to do, when we have those quote unquote breaks, you can kind of go back and review your question sheet. If there's something you want to make as a note to yourself, you can do your keep and throw away stuff and do the issues out there, and we'll have breaks built into the presentation. All right? So now let's get things rolling. This screen isn't changing. Oh, there we go. Okay. And these are things that you all will have already known about. So here we go. All right. So when we talk about this idea of anti-Black racism, let's just take a minute and think about this question. Why might anti-Black racism be central to American racism or even to American society? So before I run my mouth, take a minute, let it settle. Think about it, reflect. I'm bringing in my experience at a Jesuit institution. Take a moment for reflection, all right? So just take a moment and think on that. All right, we good? All right, making sure this mic was good. All right, so when we think about this idea of anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness being central to American racism, sometimes we don't think about, American racism as an institution. We don't think about American racism as something that you could kind of characterize, but oh, believe me, American racism, I think back to this old Dave Chappelle's, it's Chris Rock, this old skit where he talks about racism in the United States, and he does kind of the chef's kiss. He's like, it's like, it gets no better. And, I hate to make light of it, but the reality is that a lot of the anti-Blackness, a lot of the racism that we see around the globe, it's been informed by things that have their origins in the United States of America. And it's one of those moments where a lot of times we engage in American exceptionalism, and I think it would be odd for us to think that we're only exceptional in the good things. If you're gonna be kind of the top of the heap, there's gonna be things that if they're permeated through your society, if they're woven into your society, you're probably going to communicate those to the rest of the world. You're gonna communicate them as fundamental pieces of the fabric that you have. So we have up here this idea of American society, okay? And American society, when we really think about it, you talk about some of the origins of the construction of race, the construction of what we would have as kind of our class system that we never like to talk about. In America, we don't like to talk about race. We like to talk about class probably less than we talk about race. But part of the ways that we've designated ourselves in the United States, especially in the early days, is we started on this progression towards the construction of whiteness. And when we constructed that whiteness, what it meant to be white, we were taking all these different ethnic groups, all these different categories, these lived experiences, and there were these different points, let me move away from that. There were these different points in our history where we had kind of opportunities to open doors. We had opportunities to kind of a fork in the road or choose your own adventure book. And at each one of those points, if we really look back, most of the time we lean towards constructing more of this, kind of a two-tiered system where we'd lean into the construction of whiteness, and then anything that wasn't going into that construction of whiteness, a lot of times, in the early days would be constructed as what will become Blackness. And in some of the effort to really, build out society and to have some structure and some form to society and to make sure that people of a wide variety of social or economic classes, and I keep not wanting to have that give you guys reverb, making sure that people had something that they could hold on to, we started to have this way of upholding whiteness by really taking a lot of time to engage in anti-Blackness. Okay, so if things were Black, they were less than. Black people were given the things that were less than. Black people were treated less than human. We use negative terminology to talk about Black people. Even today, sometimes we catch ourselves, and I try to stop myself from doing this all the time. We look back on the early days of our country, even before it was a country, and we talk about the slaves. We talk about people going get slaves from Africa, things of that nature. And I have to correct myself because nobody was going get slaves. Nobody was taking slaves. at the end of the day, we weren't really talking about quote unquote slaves. We were talking about human beings who were enslaved. They were in a state of servitude. But through chattel slavery, where we're talking about making that moment in someone's life be their whole existence and the existence of their children and their children's children, we started to have this classification of folks that would be less than human. So instead of, people who were enslaved, people who found themselves, which is totally unacceptable in itself, but we started to say, oh, they were slaves, and then we started to use the M word and whatever other related words, and we started telling the narrative of, well, slaves were taken or brought. No, those were free people, individuals, humans, who were enslaved and brought here. But all of those things are origins of how we have this idea of anti-blackness being central to American racism. Because every time that we look at different elements of racism, different elements of exclusion in our systems, in our structures, we can always trace the roots back to those origins of anti-blackness. And if we don't take the time to recognize that, to try to say, well, what are the first steps that we're gonna take in deconstructing the anti-blackness, how are we ever gonna get to the point of recognizing the best ways to treat and support and deal with all of the different folks who encounter racism who might not happen to be Black? So us dealing with anti-Blackness is not just something where it's like, oh, this is a service to Black folks. No, this is something for all of us. Because if we have a disease, we're dealing with it right now. If we're dealing with a disease that can spread from person to person, then we have to deal with it collectively. If you have a cancer in your body, the solution is not to ignore it. The solution is to say, what is it? Where did it come from? Where is it located? How can I make the rest of my body stronger? How can I attack it? You start coming up with all of these solutions. You come up with all of this discovery. You take time to really recognize the fight that you're in. But when we talk about racism as a whole, when we talk about particularly anti-Black racism, when we talk about some of the ills of our society or some of those ills that filter into our spaces in higher education, be it across the sector or specifically here at the University of Utah, sometimes we make the mistake to focus directly in that moment, to look right at, okay, this is the situation that's going on, and we don't start thinking about those roots and how do we uproot and how do we do all of these things and how is it connected. So that's where we have this connection between really seeing the importance of anti-Blackness as well as the importance of how it factors into the need that we have to really engage, as anti-racists who are gonna try to uproot some of these things. And remember, there's gonna be a lot of question marks today. Okay, because I recognize I only have a few hours with you all, and you have a wonderful team of folks, and you all are wonderful folks who are engaging in the different spaces where you have influence. So you're gonna walk away en route to solutions, but we're not solving all of this today. That's why you're gonna see a lot of questions, and we're gonna leave them open-ended. I used to tell my students, one of my favorite classes to teach was a course called Race, Wealth, and Inequality in American Politics. Taught it for years, great stuff. Not always fun, but great stuff to talk about. But in that, I would have students and say, okay, by the end of class, are we gonna solve all this? And I would be like, well, if I had solved all of this, I wouldn't be here with y'all. I'd be somewhere with my MacArthur Genius Grant or something. I'd be on my private island because this is something that is centuries upon centuries. It's just human history here, coming to this point. So please, for folks out there on the internet, folks here, we're definitely gonna get on a trajectory towards doing better, towards growth, towards, getting some wins under our belt. But please don't think, boy, I'm going in on that one day and it's gonna be good. Next week we'll have the report, the president will come out and be like, we're done, everybody. Everybody go home. Like, if that's what you were thinking, I'm sorry. You might want to take your bagel and, go elsewhere, because this is a call to action. This is a call to work. So when we think about anti-Black racism, sometimes we think solely about ways in which some individuals who are members of our communities may end up feeling like they are excluded. They may feel like they are marginalized. They may feel hurt. They may feel put upon. But a lot of times we don't think about anti-Black racism and the role that it plays as a barrier to progress for our whole enterprise. You know, we talk in university terms, a lot of times we talk about enterprise risk management. We talk about things that could put the whole enterprise, you know, in danger, things that could really harm our goals, the trajectory that we want to go on. And a lot of times we don't take the time to really think about anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism, something that is woven through not only American society, but through the cultures at our colleges and universities, as something that we need to think about, something that can definitely, in sometimes little bites, little chipping away in different ways, and other times it could blow up in something big as a challenge to all types of progress that we want to make in terms of bringing in the best and the brightest talent among our workforce, our faculty, our students, our community partners, in terms of really being a space of growth and knowledge creation that more people in more spaces feel connected to, you know, across the country or across the world. There are lots of different ways that when we think of progress, we could say, well, without anti-Black racism, we may be in another space when it comes to potential progress. So we have up there allowing anti-Black racism to fester and to permeate impedes progress and prosperity in a multitude of ways across institutions and society. So this is one of those moments where we're not gonna go to the boards or anything, but I did wanna take another minute of reflection for folks to just think about ways in which anti-Black racism may see itself, you know, perpetuating from, you know, generation to generation, year to year, in the spaces that you find yourselves. Spaces at the university, spaces in other places. You know, it could be spaces that you have influence over, it could not be. But just think about the ways in which progress and prosperity either are or could be threatened because we turn a blind eye to racism as a whole or in particularly anti-Black racism.
And as you're taking your moment to think, maybe if you want to jot some of those thoughts down on a Post-it, on one of those postcards or note cards, that might be helpful to help you get your thoughts going.
So before I make my way around the room, just to ask for a few people to tell us, you know, what they're thinking about, let's just think through some of the many ways in which anti-Blackness kind of shows itself in our society, in the spaces that we're called to navigate. Across the country, we have, you know, versions of the Crown Act that have gone into various state legislatures. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I talk about the Crown Act? Okay, a few folks. Would you like to, Mr. President, would you like to tell us what it is?
I love.
Recently, a version there was in our state legislature that has to do with respect to dress and hairstyles in the workplace and having rules and guidance that protect against discrimination.
Exactly. So one of the easiest ways to simplify it is that there was a call and really, you know, political action taking place across the country for people to go into state legislatures to say, well, we need some version of the Crown Act to be able to create space where people could be at work, particularly Black folks, could be at work with their hair coming out of their head the way that God made it come out of their head. And, you know, people will be like, what? We need an act to protect for people to be able to be at work with hairstyles that go with the way that their hair naturally comes out of their head, or hairstyles that go with cultural traditions within, you know, this person's culture? Yes. And this is in 2020, 2021, 2022. Right now, we have a Supreme Court nominee who is probably on TV right now, you know, going through her hearings and she has locks. And there are many jobs and many spaces where they maybe don't have the protections of the Crown Act yet, where she could be barred from getting that job, having that job, and it could be a rather low-level job compared to Supreme Court. Well, most jobs are low-level compared to Supreme Court justice, but people being discriminated against due to their hair, and a lot of it being rooted in anti-Blackness. So, I mean, we have that example, and that's one of those examples where a lot of times when we start and we're talking about anti-Black racism or the concept of anti-Blackness and we go into examples, then we start thinking, people think we're gonna start with something from 1692 or something like that, and it's like, this is one that's happening like now, okay? So we're still trying to dismantle things that have been baked into our system. And if people feel the need to go as far as to get laws created state to state to state, that means this is happening state to state to state. This means that it's baked into systems that people have encountered it on a regular basis. Let's go with a global anti-Blackness. Do you know one of the, yes, the fans are clapping for us. So do you know one of the best-selling cosmetic products in many parts of the world is basically bleach?
Whitening.
So we have skin bleaching. Skin bleaching is a big deal in many parts of the world where you have people with darker skin tones. Through colonization, imperialism, we ended up having, a period in time leading us to this time where European powers really were in command in so many different parts of the world that lighter skin tones were created as more desirable, even though it was the opposite of what people in South Asia may look like, or people in Latin America, excuse me, or in, if somebody could give me a glass of water, that would be really helpful. It might be drier in Salt Lake than in Denver, I don't know. Where you have people who are going against who they are naturally, and they're paying money to not just say, oh, I'm gonna clear up a few blemishes, to go down many different skin tones. I don't know how many people are baseball fans, but if you've seen Sammy Sosa lately, Google it. Sammy Sosa, for the length of his career, he was, a good bit darker than me, and now he's lighter than light. He's bleached his skin to a certain point, and it's not just about, some people will say, oh, well, is that personal preference? And yes, obviously, we're all humans. We have self-determination. You can have personal preferences. But when you really look into the research behind skin bleaching in lots of different cultures, you see that people equate getting that lighter skin with success, with power, with being more successful and having more access. Okay? So when you have those things in place, that shows us that this is deep, this is embedded, that this is something that through policies, through practices, through various cultural indicators, darker skin tones have been looked down on. And we can easily root that, particularly in our United States space, in anti-Blackness. I mean, we see it play out in other parts of the world, but certainly here. Let's go with one more global, okay? Everybody's been paying attention to the war in Ukraine, right? 27, 28 days of just horror. And has anyone paid attention to some of the things that are happening on the border, where some people are able to leave and other people have not been? In many cases, and I had to do my own research because I was seeing that there were lots of particularly African immigrants who were in the Ukraine to get their graduate degrees, to get other degrees. There are also students who are there from South Asia and some other places. And I was like, Ukraine? Why would people choose Ukraine? Because, I'm an American, I have a limited view, I need to do better. Okay, so I started doing my research and I found out that during the Soviet era, that the Ukraine, that's where they really concentrated a lot of their best higher ed institutions. So then once you end up having the Eastern Bloc fall, you end up having the institutions were still there. And it's a great value. If you want to enter into the European market, you want to enter into medical professions, a lot of different professions, it's a good place to go. So despite the fact that there is some racism, and and it's very foreign to a lot of people from South Asia or from Africa. They go there. But now that the war broke out, both on the Ukrainian side, they were being told, well, you can't leave, basically you're less than, you're not Ukrainian, all these different things. And then some of the bordering countries said, we don't want to accept black and brown people. So you have people who were stuck kind of on a proverbial island. And it's one of those things where you're like, damn, anti-blackness strikes again. This idea that black folks in particular are a threat, that black folks are less than, that wait a minute, we were taking your tuition dollars and all of those things, but now you're on your own. I saw an interview with a gentleman from Cameroon, and he said that he was trying to leave. They wouldn't leave, and they told him, well, you have to stay. We'll give you a rifle. And he's like, well, I got love for y'all, but you're mistreating me. I'm from Cameroon. I'm not gonna stay and fight in this war. But he saw other white outsiders, other white immigrants who were there. They were like, oh, you need to go? Go ahead, get on your way. So we end up having these international situations that play out where it's not just a general racism. In many cases, we have it be a little bit more targeted, or at least rooted in this idea of blackness as a threat. Blackness is something that is less desirable, all of those types of things. So those are just a few examples. Let me give you one more for good measure. Okay, we talked about the Crown Act. We talked about some things with hair and fashion. If any of you pay attention to, fashion, what's hot, all of these things, you've probably heard of this idea of cultural appropriation. And, it gets a little interesting when it comes to Black American culture, because American culture is so deeply rooted in blackness, yet for the majority of Americans and for folks who are, who analyze American culture, a lot of times it's hard for people to come to grips with that. But when we talk about quote unquote American food, American music, American entertainment, it's so deeply rooted in blackness, in, origins of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, all of those things. But we see a lot of the times that black art forms, black forms of expression, black forms of dress, things that people would consider black. Doesn't mean, it's labeled as black, but things that have their origins in the black community a lot of times are deemed unprofessional, unacceptable. You can't wear that at work. You wouldn't want to be seen doing this. You don't want to listen to this music. But how many times can we think about things that slowly but surely make their way into the mainstream? To the point that all of a sudden we look up and it's almost as if it was something that was created by the white majority. When we can look at the evolution of jazz, we can look at, for folks who pay attention to jewelry, door knocker earrings, big earrings, nameplate chains, like Sex and the City. Carrie would have the Carrie in her earring, and it's like, for how many decades was that unacceptable, quote unquote unacceptable, in professional spaces or in white dominated spaces? So we could go down all of these pop culture areas when we talk about the idea of tanning, the idea of lip implants, the idea of all kinds of other body modifications that in many cases we look at it and we say, that feels like that's kind of an imitation of things that were deemed unacceptable, that were deemed black. But if we're able to kind of strip the quote unquote blackness away from it, it's something that's powerful. It's something that is very desirable. We can talk about that from political thought. We can talk about it from culture, from fashion, for all these different elements where when it's solely looked at as black, folks characterize it as less than. They characterize it as a threat. We don't want our children around it. We don't want to see it. But if we can figure out a way to pull that heart of blackness out, now all of a sudden that form of entertainment, that form of expression, that form of thought, that form of dress, anything that we can think of, all of a sudden we figure out ways for it to be a little more acceptable. Or if we have something that is rooted in blackness, and even if we don't have someone who would be considered white in American modern day context performing it or presenting it, but we have somebody who is not black presenting it or performing it. Recently, the actress and comedian Awkwafina, she got into a lot of hot water. She's on Raya, the Disney movie. If anybody has kids, I have kids, so my son watches all the time. But she's in lots of different spaces, but she was criticized for her quote unquote black scent. So for a long time, she spoke with a vernacular and a style of talk that a lot of people said, well, it feels like you're imitating black folks, imitating a characterization of what black folks would sound like. And she really had to come to some reckoning with that. And she is an Asian American woman. So when we talk about this idea of, anti-blackness, cultural appropriation, sometimes it's not something that is solely going to be this black-white dynamic. There are lots of different stops between there. There are lots of different spaces where people can plug in, where people can actually take part in this. And we end up having somebody who rose to fame, utilizing kind of, a hip hop vernacular, quote unquote black scent, all of those things. And she's no doubt a talented person, but then the question comes up, what's going on? She was nominated for, I believe, an NAACP Image Award. And that's when some black folks were just like, all right, that's it. Now, wait a minute. We kind of let you slide with the black scent. We were cool. We watched your movies, all of that stuff, Crazy Rich Asians, all that stuff. But hold up. We're going to have to call you out. We got to have, this moment. We got to have a conversation, Awkwafina, because, this isn't just acceptable. So we have that, right in our faces, this idea that you can kind of utilize, quote unquote, blackness as a vehicle. If it's used as a vehicle, please tell me how that could not be anti-blackness. That, you don't want the person who it comes to naturally delivering it, but hey, it's still something that I want to see, okay? Now, the last thing I'll say before I come to y'all is when we talk about anti-blackness, I talked about, we talked about this idea of BIPOC, black, indigenous, people of color. So I did, the IPOC, everybody else can kind of engage in blackness, anti-blackness. So can our white brothers and sisters engage in anti-blackness. But something that sometimes we forget is that it's so baked in, it has permeated our society so much that black people can engage in anti-blackness. That we have situations in black families, and that's not in a United States context, in a context of the Afro-Latinidad, when we talk about, the continent of Africa, all these different spaces where people engage in colorism. When we going back to the skin bleaching, when people talk about, who are you going to marry because of considering you want to have, hair textures that may be a little bit closer aligned to European hair textures. You talk about the idea of folks wanting to have a lighter partner, to have lighter children. And now, these are things that occur, but I don't want everybody walking out of here like, guess what? All black people want these. No. It happens. Just like not every white person is engaging in these things. These are things that happen with some folks, but it's enough of a trend that it's not like two people and then it dies off. It's there. So you have these different elements where even black folks will tell other black people if they're doing something that I guess you could consider authentically black, well, is that professional? The whole idea of code switching, particularly in the United States, is very much rooted in the fact that in order to operate and succeed and to thrive in predominantly white spaces, many times black folks feel like they have to present a version of themselves in how they're going to speak, how they're going to interact, social cues that they take, the ways in which they will present themselves, the ways in which they will do their hair, everything. They will think about that and they will have one version of themselves that they present at work, and they will have another version of themselves when they're engaged with what I call black time. Because I have spent the majority, if not all of my professional career in I would say PWIs, very predominantly white institutions. So I can't lie, there are moments I get to the end of the week and I'm like, where's the black people? What are we gonna do today? Where are we gonna go? What are we gonna do? And you have some folks who heavily engage in this idea of code switching. I've taken a different approach, where over the years, I said, I can't do it. It's driving me crazy. So I had to figure out, well, how do I take kind of the black time relax Chris and kind of get him closer to the professional time Chris, have them meet in the middle and just be one Chris. I hear y'all talking about, one you, well, one Chris, because I really don't have time to switch it up. I gotta just be me. I have to do these things. So, I'm like, if I have to go into a space where I have to engage in some high-level code switching, that's not the space for me. Right. But that's me. I have a luxury to do that because I have progressed to that point throughout a career. I have the degrees, I have the experience, I have the positions. Whereas if I was 22-year-old Chris trying to start off entry level somewhere, I might not have those types of luxuries. So I just bring those examples up to remind you all that, sometimes for survival's sake and other times just because it's something that's passed down, we have anti-blackness that even permeates black spaces. So now I will shut up for a moment. And I really would love to hear, at least from a few of you, when we took the time for you to really think about, anti-black racism in spaces that you might occupy, what came to mind? Okay, I see some microphones. So, and you don't have to give us like a master's thesis. It's just, whatever ideas kind of pop to mind. All right.
I looked at it as kind of like in leadership, right? Not having the representation in leadership and overlooking things like you talked about the Crown Act. That happens, or we see issues in marketing sometimes that, we see an offensive either just ad or commercial or something, and people are like, didn't recognize because we don't have people in leadership of diverse, of blackness, of, those are the things that I see happen in some of my circles.
And I guess you could say in those spaces too, is there anybody to kind of take the temperature, to sound the alarm when anti-blackness is being presented, when it's being perpetuated? It doesn't mean that it only has to be black people that could do it, but you're less likely to have colleagues who are going to say, hey, everybody, let's slow down. Let's think about that. Why are we thinking this way? What are we considering? What are we not considering? And that really goes into even some of the broader aspects of the EDI work that continues to need to happen. But once again, to really get to the meat of the EDI work, in many cases, we have to, wrestle with, something that is so very American, when we talk about, anti-blackness. Who else?
Anyone online have something? Do we have any comments from folks online?
I'll go ahead and speak. I went to law school in a majority black city where the percentage of black students in my class was probably about 1% to 2%.
Wow. Yeah, those are situations where you have, spaces, it kind of goes either way, where you have spaces that you would assume, like you said, a majority black city, you would assume that black folks would be able to partake or would be partaking in anything that was offered in that space, but because of systems and structures that we've inherited, the reality is none of us were here to create them from the start, but a lot of us have, willingly and sometimes knowingly, sometimes not knowingly inherited and walked into those spaces. You have that type of situation, and you also have spaces where you might not, they might be like the city of Salt Lake. I was looking it up last night. What is Salt Lake like less than 2% black? And when you come here, you see the mountains, you see a nice city, and you're like, man, this is a place where people would want to thrive. And sometimes we forget about all the elements of anti-blackness that would make a person think about going to or not going to a city. And it's things that you have, your brain is working. This is a moment in the mind of Chris. So my brain's working on whatever I need to work on. But you never turn off kind of like that little sensor, little calculator of when you pick up on things that are sometimes low level, sometimes high level, things that are anti-blackness, because that's who you are. When you have something that's against.
Sorry, I had an Amber Alert.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh, we gotta leave. It's like right when I'm getting to the good part. When you're navigating spaces and you're thinking about the job at hand, you're thinking about so many different things, but you're also seeing the absence of support, the absence of blackness. You're seeing ways in which either anti-blackness is kind of proactive in spaces where people are actively engaged, or sometimes more passively, but it's just something that's been inherited. You can't stop calculating that. And I can speak for myself, that sometimes when deciding where to locate yourself and your family for a job, when thinking about spaces to visit, anything else, you're asking questions, you're thinking about, well, how much can I handle? I mean, these are real conversations that I have with my wife, particularly since we have 2 young boys. When we're looking for a place to locate, it's can we handle it? Even when we were going to Colorado, we had to really think about it. And we had gone to Omaha, Nebraska, and funny enough, Omaha, Nebraska has a higher percentage of black folks in their metro area than a percentage of black folks in Denver. So we ended up really having to have serious conversations. And these are conversations that my white colleagues I talked to them, they really didn't have to have it, even if they go to a majority black city. Or, they're like, oh, but we know there'll be suburbs or enclaves or spaces that will be, supported for us. And they won't name it, they won't talk about it, but it's just something that's not thought about. But being black in America means not just when you're talking about where you're gonna live, but vacations, anything you have to think about, what will be poured into me and my children? Will it be positive? Will it be negative? Will I be seen? Will I not be seen? If I present myself as my full and authentic self, will I be encouraged to thrive? Or will I be beaten down into something different? Or people will attempt to beat me into something different for their own comfort. These are real things that you have to think about. And like I said, having 2 black boys in America who I want to raise into productive and happy and healthy black men, these are real things to think about. Because even in areas that are quote unquote predominantly black, you have issues because it's in an American context. But then when you go into spaces that are not that, you have those issues. So that brings up, a great point to think about when it comes to, anti-blackness kind of showing itself in spaces. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, did we? Let's do a, Mike, I'm sorry, because the online people might not hear you.
Oh, it's right there. I had the opportunity to attend a session last month from the Black Cultural Center here on campus, and it was truly eye-opening for me in the regards of how often we don't, as you were sharing, have to necessarily think about those things. But I learned that in the state of Utah, it is not required in school, esthetician school, thank you for the right word, to know how to work with black hair. So many salons in our city are turning away clients or going ahead and ruining people's hair because they have no training, and it is not required in our licensing here in the state of Utah to learn how to do so.
And I can speak for Colorado that at least at the time that my barber was getting licensed, because when I first moved here, I'm talking to the barber and we just started talking about diversity, whatever else, and he talked about how he and the guy who owns the barbershop, this is a black barbershop I go to, black barbers. But when I lived in Illinois, I went to a Mexican barbershop with a Mexican barber, and he was great, hooked me up. As long as you can do the haircut right, I'm rolling. But in any case, I was talking to the guys, and they were talking about how when they were getting licensed, that they had to go find either black or Latino people to be their test cases for their licensing because the licensing wasn't designed that you could bring a black client in. And you're talking about black barbers who have to go work in black barbershops. So one, that's a problem because that makes you feel less than. It makes you, let me go find, my white friend. I need you to come and do this. But also it makes you so worried because it's very clear that at least at the time they were getting licensed. I didn't look into what things look like now, but it's probably similar to here in Utah, that there's no requirement that you have proficiency in working with different hair textures, with different hair, and that can be very problematic. So it's almost like you have black folks in kind of a wild, wild west of unlicensed, untrained space, because that means that even if they go to a quote unquote black salon, black barbershop with black folks, the state isn't checking to see if they could do what they had to do properly. And if you can look at that and say, well, oh, that's not anti-blackness, we're running into some issues there. I mean, that's really something that we need to think about. So thank you for that, because that's, and we go down the line, with so many different spaces where either it used to be, on the books, and then, it just becomes practice. When we talk about housing discrimination, when we talk about so many other elements that are so central to our lives, or even when we talk about education. You know, we have big debates brewing, you know, across the country, you know, where folks are thinking that second graders are being taught law school concepts or something like that. We have, you know, debates we just got out of February. People talk about, well, why do we need Black History Month? And I talk about, well, it's the bubble effect. And what I mean by the bubble effect is a lot of times when you look in American history textbooks or you look in American government textbooks, at the end of chapters, there'll be bubbles. And it'll say, well, this is 2 things that Black people were doing, and this is something that white women were doing, and this is, and most of the time it'll be women too, mind you. Because we, in the United States, we love to say women and people of color, like there aren't women of color, as opposed to being comfortable enough to say white men, white women, you know, black women, black men, all of those things, to say, well, okay, there's gonna be some variations in lived experience. Nope, we like to quickly pull stuff together. So women, a lot of times, is a cover for just white women. And then Black women or Latinas or anybody else has to find their way, you know, because yeah, you're really part of the women group, and then, oh, well, people of color, well, now you're facing sexism within that space. So just throwing that out there as something that I really try to avoid saying, because you get pulled into it, or I try to call it out when I'm in meetings, to say it's nothing wrong with talking about the lived experiences of our white sisters. To say, well, okay, you are a woman and you are facing, you know, a variety of challenges, but also you're navigating spaces in whiteness. Whereas you have somebody else who is a woman who is navigating a space in Blackness. And we have this idea, you know, of anti-Blackness that's gonna play out in a certain way for a Black woman. It's gonna play out in a different way for a Black man. And sometimes there's gonna be ways in which they're connected. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for those. You know, keep thinking, keep jotting things down. Jot things down for yourselves. We're gonna continue conversing. Moving forward, this idea of missed opportunities. Anti-Black racism's legacy. And I'm gonna take, you know, I talked about a few things, I'll talk about a few more, but we have to remember that we are creating tomorrow's history today. Far too often we look at history and we forget that we're moving forward. We're getting older. We don't like to own up to it. You know, we talk about, you know, we forget that we're in the pandemic of COVID-19. Why was it called that? It was discovered in 2019. It's 2022. And we still feel like it's 2020 because we're still in the midst of this pandemic. But no, let me remind you that some of the things that we had to do or the things that we did in 2020 are now history. We're looking back on it and we say, oh, remember when this all started? And remember when we didn't have a vaccine? And remember this and remember that? And just think as we go, decade to decade to decade, how whatever we do or don't do now is really the history that the next generations of historians, students, people in our families are gonna look back and look at that. And sometimes we don't think of the gravity of the fact that what we do individually and especially what we do collectively goes into the annals of history. You know, we have to think about that. So when we look at missed opportunities in the United States, a few missed opportunities, I was talking with some colleagues last night. You know, we can look at some of the guideposts in American history as missed opportunities. Reconstruction. So we have the United States, you know, founded on, in much case, you know, you're talking about, you know, as we had the land acknowledgement, land that was taken, you know, people that were decimated. We have other people who were stolen from their homeland, used to build the nation's capital, used to build so many other spaces. We have that as a legacy, as the beginnings of, you know, our economic strength, of so many other parts of our history. But then we have the Civil War, you know, huge situation. Civil War ends, we have an opportunity, Reconstruction. But Reconstruction is stunted, it's ended. President that takes over after Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, he's from Tennessee. When he gets in power, he's not exactly, you know, a big fan of seeing Black folks looked at as humans, Black folks, you know, getting close to real citizenship, full citizenship, having assets. He's like, well, they used to be assets. How are we going to accept this? So we see Reconstruction stunted. So we have a missed opportunity there, missed opportunity to really incorporate folks into our political system, our political process, to incorporate Black folks into owning pieces of America, to incorporate Black folks, which you need to be proactive in that space. You can't step back and say, no more slavery, good luck. I mean, that is a space where you need the Freedmen's Bureau, where you need, you know, people to be proactive, to say, well, you were owned, you were dehumanized, you were separated from families, all of those things. How can we proactively start to build something where you're gonna remain hurt. We recognize that, but how can we set the stage for the generations to come? We leaned into it for a quick moment, pulled it back. And things got worse and worse and worse for Black folks, particularly in the South. When we talk about the Black codes giving way to Jim Crow laws, missed opportunity. When we talk about Black codes were laws that happened during Reconstruction, right after Reconstruction, where they really were ways that you would give, guidance, boundaries, prescriptions to how Black people would operate. And then there was a recognition that, wait a minute, we have Black codes, but there are a lot of white folks, particularly poor white folks, who are like, I'm cool with these Black folks. We're doing the same job. We're living in the same place. It is what it is. Let's live our lives. So then they said, well, let's come up with these Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws told everybody how to act. It put prescriptions and boundaries on white folks as to how they were to not interact or to interact with Black folks. Not only telling Black folks what to do, but also having punishments and, like I said, boundaries for white folks. Missed opportunity. Where we see policy, we see people proactively stepping in for division, for breaking people up. We talk about the early 20th century, particularly bloody summer of 1919, the times around the late teens into the 20s after World War I, where we had Black soldiers being lynched in their army uniforms, where we had whole towns being massacred. When we talk about Rosewood, when we talk about Black Wall Street, where Black folks said, okay, you don't want us, we're gonna go build our own. And then you ended up having white folks through lynchings, through massacres, taking back that wealth, taking that land, taking that space, taking away that progress. Missed opportunity. What if those areas had been allowed to flourish? What if those folks were able to operate in spaces where we were lessening the anti-Black racism instead of ramping it up to the point of massacre? We move into World War II, we talk about the Double V campaign. What we mean by that is that a lot of people who were civil rights activists, Black rights activists in the United States, saw World War I and what happened after with Bloody Summer and all those things as a big missed opportunity. As I said, missed opportunity. They said, well, we're going into another world war, we won't miss that opportunity. So we're gonna do double V. We're gonna have victory abroad, victory at home. And we ended up seeing World War II as a space where a lot of the folks who ended up being the drivers of the civil rights movement got a lot of their boldness, got a lot of their ideas, engagement by engaging with World War II, either at home or abroad, engaging in the workforce, engaging abroad where people say, well, I've seen something else. It doesn't have to be this way. Have you ever gone, even on a light level, you go on vacation, you go visit a family member, and you see something. It could be the smallest thing. Oh, I went to this city, their public transportation is better than ours. It doesn't have to be this way. Oh, wow, they have curbside delivery of whatever, of goods at Home Depot. It doesn't have to be this way. We should have it in my town. So think about if we have that feeling for little simple pleasures. Think about if you are a soldier in World War II and you help in the liberation of France and you have white folks in France who actually are looking at you like a human being. Do you want something to eat? Do you want to go to a party? And they're like, wait, who, me? Oh, yeah, I would like to do that. I like to eat. I like to listen to music. I like to do all those things. And you start to recognize that the world doesn't have to be the way that you've seen it. I even talk about when my wife and I went on vacation to Ireland. Had a wonderful time. And it was one of the things where I had so many cool conversations with people in Ireland about how they idolize people within the civil rights movement in the United States, because that was a model for a lot of the work that they did in trying to liberate themselves. And just having conversations where people were looking at me, white folks, because I'm conditioned as an American, so I'm trying to see them as Irish, but I'm also seeing white folks, and it's like, 40-something years, I'm used to that. And it's white folks saying, hey, come on in. And maybe they wanted me for my American dollars. Maybe they didn't see any barriers with race, whatever it was. I don't know what it was, but it felt good. And, it's one of those things where then you come back to the United States, and it's much different than the World War II context, but I felt like, oh, wow, it can be cool like this. I can just go into random white spaces, be accepted, all of those things. And there were times where my wife and I were at restaurants, and the only uncomfortable stares and eyes that we got weren't from the Irish folks. It was from other visitors. In many cases, Americans or other folks who were like, what is this Black couple doing in Ireland? And it's like, and you feel it. You feel it because it's the same eyes that you get at restaurants in the United States. And now you're getting it in other spaces. So and that's minor. It's minor, but it's major, but it's one of those things where it's nothing like a World War II soldier. But I'm trying to relate for you all to think about how they felt when they come back, so they weren't gonna take it. So you end up having these circumstances that led into the civil rights movement, but while all this is happening, what happens with the GIs when they come home? GI Bill. So we have, access to education, access to housing, missed opportunity. We had so many limitations on what black folks could do and not do, with that expenditure of funds that really created the white middle class, that created white suburbs. And with that, I'm going to see if we can click to this YouTube clip. And this helps us to think about neighborhoods as incubators for anti-blackness. So think about the spaces you've lived, the spaces you've occupied, and check this out for a few minutes, and then we'll think and talk. All right. All right, so as you can see, yet another missed opportunity, a huge missed opportunity. We think about this idea of neighborhoods as incubators for anti-blackness. Let's think of a few ways that neighborhoods, the places we live, can really be those incubators. All right, so a lot of times we don't tell these stories. This video's old, y'all. I've used it for years. It's been out for a couple of decades. This research is nothing new. I did a lot of this research when I was in grad school decades ago, looking at the racial wealth gap, looking at the construction of whiteness, the building of white wealth, the building of the white middle class, the ways in which, we had those missed opportunities. All these things are things that people have talked about well before I ever started looking into it. But on a day-to-day basis, we don't have these conversations. I spent a lot of my teaching career in Illinois. Had a lot of students who were from the Chicago suburbs. And when I would have conversations with them, either in a group or I'd have conversations with them individually, and once again, we're talking about very predominantly white institutions, so most of the students were white, but a lot of times they came from areas that were very homogenous, where their high school, their neighborhood, they were coming from spaces that were very much white, but they're in the Chicago area. So when we look at, there's pockets within Chicago which are heavily black, heavily Latinx, heavily other non-white populations, shall we say. But the students, nobody in their families, nobody in their neighborhoods ever took a moment to say, well, why are these areas so white? It was almost like somebody sprinkled, like white seeds in the ground and white children popped up and families and households, and that was it. There was no design there. There was no intentionality there. That's just the way it is. We talk about neighborhoods like that in the United States. This just is a black neighborhood. This just is a white neighborhood. This just is an upper middle class neighborhood. And we take a lot of the onus off of ourselves or anybody else. So, it just happened. That's just the way it was. But we just saw on the video, big plan. We talked about, what did they say? Over $120 billion. And we're talking about mid-20th century dollars. So 30s up to like the early 60s, less than 2% of it went to non-whites. Not less than 2% of it went to black folks. We had to cut the pie up between black folks, Native American populations, Asian American populations, Latinx populations. All these different populations were in that 2% of that pie that was distributed. So I think we're seeing a trend here that there was a certain intentionality to really undergird and uplift white folks, in saying, okay, most of our population, if we look at the first part, the early part of the 20th century, you had people who were destined to become white, in many cases much more identifying by their ethnicity. In urban enclaves, you have an Irish part of town, a Polish part of town. I'm Catholic. You go to cities and you have all these Catholic churches. I lived in Rock Island, Illinois for years. And I would sit there and I'd say, this little town has Catholic churches on all these different blocks. The same thing in Omaha, lived there for a few years. All these Catholic churches. And then you get the explanation. Well, there was segregation amongst the people who are now white. So you had to have the Polish Catholic Church and the German Catholic Church, and you had to have the Irish Catholic Church and all these different Catholic churches. And every once in a while in some cities, you'd finally get a black Catholic church. But the black Catholic Church would come, particularly with me thinking back to Omaha, through straight up strife and segregation, where it was like the black Catholics finally come to work in meatpacking plants in Omaha. They try to go to the Catholic church that's closest to them. The white folks don't want them there, so they finally forced the Archbishop to build a little tiny church for them. This is churches, y'all. So, you know, we think about neighborhoods, we think about churches, and I'm just using the Catholic Church as an example because it pops up in all these different cities. But we had the first part of the 20th century where white folks really weren't white yet. You know, in many cases, we're talking about the construction of whiteness. So they were identifying as Irish, as Italian, all of these different things. But then when we hit the middle of the 20th century and we start to suburbanize, the United States government, the Federal Housing Administration, they recognize we're not gonna build an Irish suburb and an Italian suburb and all of these things. So let's pull folks together. But then in order to create one thing, we have to have it juxtaposed with something else. So you end up, it's like, what tool do we have in the toolbox? And somebody's like, anti-blackness, it never fails. You know, so they pull out anti-blackness, and you end up having that as kind of the basis. And then you say, okay, we can be anti-other groups too. But we're gonna create this whiteness. So you start to have these neighborhoods that are full of folks who formerly lived in these ethnic enclaves, and even amongst themselves. When we look, you know, with our sociologist friends, we start to look at the construction of whiteness, and you start to see how people started to feel like it was advantageous for them to shed various elements of their, ethnicity in order to move forward. So you end up seeing people create this new version of, you know, who are they going to be? All right? So this is how the big missed opportunity really created space that means so much to us in higher education. Because where do most American families hold their wealth? In their home. And even today in 2022, in a majority black neighborhood, same construction, same house, everything else, is that house gonna be worth the same as an identical house in a majority white neighborhood? No. So we end up having barriers to wealth. And wealth is the key to so many different things that we have in the United States. So now, come on, thing. All right, we on the same page. So now it is time for us to think and report out, okay? And with that, we can take a break. Let's do about a 10-minute break. Does that work for everybody? So let's do 10 minutes, and when we say think and report out, if you need to take time for this to wash over you, do that. If you need to work on your things that you want to keep, things that you want to throw away, you could do that, but also please make use of the Post-it boards around. And what I want you to think about is how anti-Black racism is hiding right in front of us. So what are some ways in which we see anti-Black racism hiding in front of us, but maybe we didn't see it until today, or maybe you've seen it, but you didn't talk about it? Here, it could be at the U, it could be in Salt Lake City, it could be in Utah, it could be in the United States. But if you all would at least jot some idea around there, and then the folks who are collecting those, make sure that we keep those together to match along with how is anti-racism hiding right in front of us. So bathroom breaks, email breaks, keep and throw away boards, and we'll get back together in about 10 minutes. Does that work for everybody? All right. Ashley, do you have anything to add?
Nope, that's perfect.
So thanks again for that, thinking on these things, for talking amongst one another, for staying. We actually have, I think, a few more people than we had before we took the break. So like I said, I'll take that as success. I didn't run folks off. Online people, still remember y'all. Hope you're hanging in there, you know, eating your snacks, doing whatever you have to do. Let's see. Okay. I guess it's taking a minute to. Okay. So we had, you know, a statement that was incorporated into this whole day. And, you know, talking about, you know, hate has no place here. And if I'm messing up y'all's statement, I'm sorry, but y'all know the statement I'm talking about. Marianne, is that it? Is it hate has no place? What is the?
Yeah, ASUU is promoting a town hall on hate has no home here.
Okay, hate has no home here. And we have to remember that when we think about anti-Black racism, sometimes it's actually deeper than hate. And what I mean by that is anti-Black racism is more nuanced than the presence of hate or the absence of hate. Sometimes we're like, oh, that's hateful. Get it out of here. That's it. You said you hate this person. You did this. You did that. Oh, this is a space where, quote unquote, there isn't hate. We're great. And we forget that hate is nuanced, but also anti-Black racism in many cases is even more nuanced, because one of the tricks of it is to get people not to talk about it, not to notice it, not to recognize it, to actually feel put upon if they do talk about it. How dare you bring that up? Why are you playing the race card? All of the different things that we hear. So how might white supremacy be undergirded by anti-Black racism? Let's take a minute and think on that. All right, so when we're thinking of, let's start by breaking down white supremacy. Sometimes when we say white supremacy, we think about neo-Nazis. We think about the Klan. We think about the Proud Boys, whatever it's gonna be. Organized groups that fall on whatever spectrum of, far reaches of, sometimes American politics and engagement. But when we talk about white supremacy in the context of this type of conversation, when we're talking about anti-Black racism, we're talking about the white supremacy that really is woven into the fabric of the United States of America, that's woven into the fabric of the Western world, that opens the door for all the different instances of anti-Blackness that we talked about in the first half of this morning's session. When we talked about how it can show up in the Ukraine, it can show up in, products, it can show up in all these different spaces, because basically, we've been fed a diet of white is white. Right? White is right. White is the aspiration. White is the best way to do things, is the best way to look, a Eurocentric approach over the course of many different generations and over centuries of colonization and imperialism around the world. We just happen to live in an era where white supremacy has been fed to folks all around the world. That's not all of human history. There are other parts where people are either disconnected or other folks had the most power, but we happen to live in this era of human history where white supremacy, particularly in an American context, where we say, well, if you do it, the way to be professional is to be white. The way to have, really full membership in society and to have full privileges and all of those things is to be white. When we talked about the examples with hair and, how are you even gonna license a beautician? When we talk about, examples when it comes to who's gonna be the ideal, for a spokes campaign or whatever it's gonna be, you have all these different things, sometimes a little more benign, other things that are much deeper that really are undergirded by anti-Blackness. Because in order to create whiteness, in order to uphold white supremacy, we end up having to have an opposite. You have to have a flip side of the coin. So when we talk about white supremacy in the context of wealth accumulation, in the context of housing and neighborhoods, as we just finished talking about with the clip in the discussion before we had the break, well, what was the flip side of that? Less than 2% of non-white folks ended up being supported by the federal government in building that wealth, in being in those places, in having those benefits. So you end up creating this paradigm. You have kind of a white side, you have a black side, and no disrespect to anybody who doesn't fall into those categories. I didn't create this. This is just the way that we've had this paradigm play out in the United States, and then we have different moments in time where folks are kind of plugged in somewhere on that pretty condensed continuum. But we end up having anti-Black racism being so nuanced that we don't recognize it's there. But it's really, that, like I said, the undergirding of white supremacy, but we don't talk about white supremacy. So we don't want to own up, because what we do is we make white supremacy the boogeyman. White supremacy is something we shall not talk about. If we do talk about it, we turn it into something that it's part, but it's not all. So we talk about, like I said, the neo-Nazis, the Klan, whatever else, but we forget to talk about the school board. We forget to talk about the city council, certain ordinances. We forget to talk about when we've all been there, you're in your 20s, you're in your college years, you're trying to go to a little nightclub, a little party, whatever it's gonna be, and all of a sudden there's a dress code. And the dress code happens to hit all the marks of the things that the black folks in the community like to wear. And you're like, so you just decided that it's gonna be, you know, a team jersey and a hat and a this and a that, but it's made out of fabric, it's covering my body, all of those things. Happened to me all my year. You know, I got 2 little kids now, don't go out anymore, but back when I used to go out, used to kick it, have a good time. You know, when you're young, you see those things. And, you know, somebody might say, well, that's nothing. You know, that's just a little thing. But when you have that, and then you have this and this and this and the hair and the skin and all of those things, and we talk about microaggressions, we sometimes talk about macroaggressions, but think about how that accumulates over the course of one's life. Think about how it accumulates at chipping away at somebody's core, at your soul, at making you feel other than, less than, and making you get angry sometimes, get sad other times. And think about the ways in which you're not even free to talk about it. When you do challenge it, playing a race card, doing this, doing that, but also think about this, where there's folks on the other side of the spectrum who maybe sometimes benefit but don't recognize it. Where they're just like, man, you know, I wish black folks would get it together. You know, why are they not just getting in line with what's going on? Think about this. If we don't talk about the ways in which our society and particularly our government have been so complicit and sometimes the driving forces in building out white wealth, in building out white suburbs, in many cases to the detriment of black folks and other people of color, then we start to build a narrative in the minds of the next generation and the generation after that, that the white folks, their grandparents, their parents, their great-grandparents, they were deserving. That, you know, they worked hard for it. We have this whole idea of rugged individualism. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Everybody should be able to do that. And the same type of stories play out in black communities, in Native American communities, in Latinx communities, where people don't talk about the ways in which that wealth was undergirded over on the white side of the tracks. And then people might start to say, well, what were my grandparents doing? You know, Dad, you should have got it together. My buddy down the road, his family has it all together, and we over here still struggling. Because when we have this whole idea of silence, we allow a lot of misperceptions to persist. They end up festering and they get into our psyche. They get into the psyche of all of us, regardless of who our identity might be. So that's where we have this idea of anti-Black racism being even deeper than hate, because it permeates all kinds of spaces in our hearts and minds that we might have no intentionality of being hateful. We're not thinking about, we might be the most loving person ever, but we're walking around misinformed. We're walking around perpetuating a lot of these things, and we're engaging sometimes in anti-Blackness against ourselves, against the person next to us, and we're not even recognizing it. But that's where you all having this type of conversation, this level of dialogue, taking some of this information and having this be a starting, not an ending, is so very powerful. I can't wait to be in some of the spaces with some of my other board of directors members for the National Association of Diversity Officers and tell them that I was at the University of Utah talking about anti-Black racism. They're gonna say, what? I'm gonna be like, look, y'all, they getting it in at your University of Utah. We need to take a minute and see what's going on over there. All right, thing, come on, cooperate with me. Okay, I think I need to be a little closer to the middle, sorry. So we have this idea of deflection and division. How anti-Black racism is used to divide and conquer, okay? So far too often, as I said, any discussions of white supremacy, any discussions of anti-Black racism, of systemic racism, of institutionalized racism, people aim to squelch those conversations. And I used to talk about this years ago, and I say, oh, people avoid these conversations. People try to shut them down. And it was much more in the abstract. It was more, hey, people shut down those conversations, let's say in a particular classroom setting, at a dinner table with friends, whatever else. Now we have full-on political movements across the country to try to squelch this type of discussion, to outlaw this type of discussion in K-12 classrooms and higher ed classrooms. In so many different spaces, there's a lot of work afoot to say, wait a minute, you know, the word's getting out. People are actually talking about the racial wealth gap. People are talking about, the ways in which white supremacy is woven through our institutions, through our society, through our organizations. They're talking about anti-blackness. They're saying something, people are actually saying out loud, Black Lives Matter. And then people will say, well, wait a minute, that's so radical. And it's like, actually, let's not talk about the movement, let's just talk about the words. Black Lives Matter, that's a pretty low bar. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the old Michael Chase special where he talks about how much lower could we get of a bar, but mattering, not better, nothing like that. So if we just look at those words, it shows us how powerful words can be and how people can really take it and say, oh my goodness, somebody saying, and like I said, saying Black Lives Matter can be seen as anti-American. What does that say about what it means for us to collectively be American? How ingrained is white supremacy, in our system and in the structures that if somebody would claim to say something of that nature, that we'd have such a vigorous debate. So these are just things for us to think about, but think about how, we try to deflect from the reality. We try to deflect from the inequities. We try to deflect from the injustices. We try to deflect, and we end up having ways in which people are divided. People that probably, if they sat down and talked through this, if we had people think, and this is where we get away from structures and we get back to individual. If we didn't have the barriers of the structures and people could meet and figure out that, 9 times out of 10, we have way more in common than we have different from one another. But we operate in these structures. But if I went around this room and I said, well, do you want the best for your family? Do you want to be in a happy and safe environment? Do you want to be able to, if you have a God, do you want to be able to connect with that God the way you'd like to connect? If you don't, do you want to be able to be in peace with not connecting? With, all of those things, if we went through the list, regardless of your racial, ethnic background, regardless of your gender identification, your sexuality, I'm betting that we'd have a lot of common answers. Like, oh yeah, of course. But we have these structures that allow us to have this division where people say, well, wait a minute, I'm not able to live my best life because there is this division, because there's anti-blackness, because there's systemic racism, and people say, don't talk about that. Like once again, the folks with kids, no, but what do they say? No, we don't talk about Bruno. Same thing. Oh, no, we don't talk about racism. No, we don't talk about whiteness or anti-blackness. So if we're never taking the time to talk about those things, then you have that weight still on some people's shoulders. And we also have a space where, I always talk about, like W.E.B. Du Bois had the souls of black folks. And I always think about the souls of white folks. When I was at Creighton, I would bring this up a lot. Being in a religious setting, I would say, when you just think about, even if you take it out of religious context, if you have folks who collectively have a space where there's some ill-gotten gains in some cases collectively, for the nation. There's also certain spaces where things have been built to the detriment of other folks and it's not even discussed. That can start to eat away at folks. That can start without people even knowing, eating away at the collective, eating away at the society, eating away at the groups when we look at the majority, when we think about the idea that you're not really coming to terms with that. Because think about if you're a kid and, I remember when I was in kindergarten, I didn't pay for milk one day, but I really wanted chocolate milk. And I just went ahead, it was like honor system, and I got me a chocolate milk. And then it was this whole thing, who got a chocolate milk? And I'm over there sipping and sipping. Think about that. I'm 44 years old, y'all, and I can remember when I got an ill-gotten gain, I took that chocolate milk, and it stuck with me, and I'm like, damn, I feel bad. Who didn't get that milk that day? I need to call somebody up, find them on Facebook, and be like, I'm sending you a carton of chocolate milks or something like that. But just think about that. We all have those situations individually where, something went on and we're like, it doesn't sit with us well. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have these discussions, because then it's going to introduce something that's going to not sit well with people, and people are going to, and that's what we talked about in the very beginning. We're going to be uncomfortable. But remember, once we navigate some of the discomfort, we can get to a place where really we become more free. Regardless of our background, you become more free, because now that's not something, it's not, Once again, in Canto, once they talked about Bruno, things started to come together. So if you have this opportunity to kind of deal with the elephant in the room, then you can move past some of the deflection and particularly the division. So we have this James Baldwin quote at the bottom. It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Think about that. Think on your own. Think of the power that each of you have in the offices, the units, the spaces that you occupy. Think of the power that you have within your family, the power that you have in your community, and think about the ways in which you do or you don't engage intersectionality, with recognizing the ways that some people could be harmed when you meet people at those intersections of gender, race, sexuality, religion, all of those things. Think about the fact that if we allow ignorance to persist, and we're in ignorance for all of us have things that we're ignorant of, but we all have some type of power. And think about that collective power as well as that individual power. If we allow ignorance to persist, how much we end up being weaponized against justice. We end up being weaponized against really uplifting intersectionality and uplifting all the tenets that we say are such a priority in EDI. So we have to be very, very mindful of the spaces that we occupy both individually as well as the spaces that we occupy collectively. You all, how many students in total attend the U every year? Oh, you said 25,000, 35?
35.
Okay, whoo, a lot of students, okay? Think about all of the spaces that they influence, that they get this degree, they get this is a part of a training for how they're going to be. A lot of times we talk about what they're gonna be, but higher education is even more about how you're going to be, how you're going to navigate spaces, how you're going to be a citizen, all of those things. And think about that type of influence if we allow certain things to fester that we don't want to see here, how that is then influencing so many different minds, so many different lives, and all the lives that they take part in. So that James Baldwin quote always sticks with me. For the few people who will be here, for the second session in the afternoon, we're gonna use that quote again, so just be ready. Use the same clip, have to have a few common things. All right now, work with me. All right. So public policy and anti-blackness. So we've talked a lot about public policy and anti-blackness, so I'm not gonna take a whole lot of time on that because it's hard to kind of escape that. So we've talked about, barber licensing, we've talked about housing policy, we've talked about lots of different things, but consider it. Think about this question here. How has the construction of whiteness been built in part via the upholding of anti-Black racism? So in the context of public policy. Okay, so we talked about it before, how anti-Black racism undergirds, white supremacy, but think about this idea of whiteness, just what it means to be white, what it means to be plugged in, and how we have all these different policies that we've talked about earlier. So just keep that in mind. So something that I want you to think about is first class or full citizenship versus second class citizenship or conditional or less than first class citizenship. A lot of times we kind of talk about it in the abstract today, but there was a time not so long ago in the United States of America that there was really only two ways to be classified as a citizen in the United States. You could have first class citizenship and be classified as white, or you could have second class citizenship and be classified as Black. And you actually had a number of cases where people from different parts of the world, the Ozawa case with a Japanese immigrant, I think it was the Singh case, and the Thin case with an immigrant from India. There's a few other cases where people came in and had cases that went to the highest courts in the land where they're saying, well, they were suing to be white. And you might say, man, people from different parts of Asia, they suing to be white, they don't love themselves. No, they love themselves. They didn't want to actually be white. They were like, I want to be in America. I want to be an American, and there's no entry point for me. I am not Black. I am not of European descent, but I want to be there. And I see how they doing those black folks. So I am going to try to jump on that white citizenship, that full citizenship, where I can own land, where I can work jobs, where I can do all of those things. They weren't thinking about it in a 2022 context. They weren't coming to the United States already indoctrinated with anti-blackness. They were pro themselves. And they said, well, if I'm going to be there, why not try to be part of that first-class citizenship? Then we look 100 years later and we see how that evolves into anti-blackness, even for folks who are arriving at our shores, coming in to say, well, if I want to be at a point of power, at a point of influence in the United States of America, I probably need to lean into this whole anti-blackness thing. I need to try to get as close, get my proximity to whiteness as good as possible. Once again, I'm not accusing people of not loving themselves. I'm not accusing people of, setting off, as soon as they wake up in the morning, what am I gonna do to black people? But we have systems and structures in place that make it very beneficial for folks to try to engage in that paradigm of kind of uplifting whiteness and engaging in anti-blackness. So when we think about this idea that when we engage in EDI work, when we engage in justice and EDI work, that we're trying to create spaces where people can bring their full and authentic selves to our institutions, be it the University of Utah, University of Denver, University of anything. We want people to be able to come. This is what we say. This is what we proclaim. We want people to be able to come to these institutions and bring their full and authentic selves and not just survive, thrive. And if we're asking people and we're saying that that's a priority, then we have to be open-minded enough and open-hearted enough for if we're gonna create space where they might be able to bring as close to their full and authentic self as possible, that the space will change over time. That what we like to do is to say, oh yeah, bring your full self, all of those things, but we don't wanna change anything. We want this place to be exactly how it was when it was not designed for you to be here, and you go figure it out. That's not a University of Utah problem, y'all. This is higher ed across the country. We're all dealing with this. That in order for us, if we say that we recognize that we have institutions and organizations that were designed with the intention of certain groups of people, certain identities, certain intersecting identities at a certain point, and now we want other people there, well, we have to be open to some adjustments. We have to be open to that. And if we're not, then we're creating a space where we have a first class or full citizenship for the folks who either fit into the mold of what the institution was originally designed for, or the folks who will carve themselves to be there, to say, well, I'm gonna present a version of myself that can get me as close to the first class citizenship as possible. There's no way to survive. You're sitting there and you're not bringing your full self. You're using up energy that could go into your studies, energy that could go into your work as an administrator, a professor, a staff member, whomever, into trying to be this fake version of yourself. I don't know, look, I'm on a TV kick now. I've been watching the Apple Plus series Severance, where they actually, has a Ben Stiller directed thing, where they actually sever your memory. And everything you do at work, you do at work. And everything you do at home, you do there, but you don't remember either one, so it's like you're two people. Please, Lord, let's not do that, y'all. Let's create spaces where we feel comfortable enough to be our home selves, bring some of that home self to work, some of that work self home. Now, I recognize you're gonna be more relaxed at home. I'm not crazy enough to think that I'm going to work exactly the same as I do if I'm with my boys from back home in Baltimore and we chilling, watching the game, drinking Yinglings and stuff, having a good time. I'm not like walking into my job with like some Timberland boots on with some shorts or something like, hey, what's up, Chancellor, how you doing? I recognize there's gonna be that difference, but sometimes people will kind of co-opt it and say, oh, well, of course, you have to be different. All of us have a chill version of ourselves and a work version. What I mean is the fundamentals shouldn't change. Like the fundamentals shouldn't have to change, okay? That you shouldn't come to work and feel like you're this totally different person that people wouldn't even recognize if they came from your family and your home. And when you're able to be that full self, that's full citizenship. That's first class citizenship. So think about full citizenship, first-class citizenship in a University of Utah context. Are you offering that to everybody, or are we in a space where we're only offering it to some people who can fit a mold that's been prescribed by people who probably aren't even alive anymore? You know, something that was built generations ago. All right. Oh, I think I hit the wrong button. Sorry, y'all. Let's think for a moment, and this is going to be kind of a self-reflection moment. Think of where else do we find anti-Blackness? How do you open your eyes and ears to recognize this cancer? So think about in your own spheres of influence, and not just spheres of influence that you influence, but what are the spheres in which you operate where you are influenced? Okay? Who are some of the people that you could talk to more, that you could listen to more? What are some spaces that you could go to get some information? You know, and now I'm not issuing a challenge for you to find your one black friend or to find your one black coworker and quiz them. There is a such thing as Google. There's many other search engines. There's lots of spaces in which you can go get some of your own information, but you have to have curiosity. Hey, we are a university. So there's some basics that, you know, you can do on your own. So I just want to put that caution out there because I don't want people to be calling me like, ever since that session, I can't get people out of my office because I'm the one black person on my floor and everybody's coming to me. Slow down, everybody. All right, but think about where are places that you can get information, where are the ways in which you can open ears, what are some things that maybe you've heard before but you dismissed it? Can you revisit and say, you know what, 5 years ago so-and-so said X, Y, Z, you know, about something that now I think that I have the language for, that feels like anti-Blackness. Let me look into that a little bit more. Let me think about that. So just take a few minutes to think. You know, not a few minutes, take a minute to think about that. And think about how does anti-Black racism shape the ways in which we view and navigate predominantly white institutions in higher education? Think for a moment about our tenure and promotion processes. Think for a moment about the ways in which we recruit, the ways in which we aim to retain talent, the ways in which we engage with our elected officials, the ways in which we engage with our student athletes, the ways in which we create spaces that might be spaces and destinations of choice for potential faculty colleagues and other colleagues who might come from elsewhere. If they're facing any challenges in the broader community, is that something where we say, well, we'll treat you good right here when we have a potluck in our office, but everything else that you have to deal with for the other, 16 hours of every day out in the rest of the community, that's not my problem. Think about those ways, in a University of Utah context, in a higher ed context, how anti-Black racism really does shape the ways in which we navigate this space, the ways in which we view this space, the ways in which we consider something professional or worthy of celebration and promotion versus something else. So just take a few minutes on your own with that, or a few moments, a few minutes. And that could even help influence some of the things you want to keep, some of the things you want to throw away. But we do still have those mics floating around somewhere. So if anybody wanted to share something, either, ways in which you might open your eyes and ears to this, or ways in which this anti-Black racism shapes, how we view and navigate higher ed, I'd love to hear from y'all. I see you had the mic. Oh, you about to hand it out this mic. Okay, I thought you were about to say something. All right. We're coming close to the end, but it's not the end yet, so y'all can still participate.
I'm sure someone has a thought they'd like to share.
All right. It only takes one to get the floodgates open. All right.
I was thinking one of the ways of related to navigating PWIs would be creation of affinity spaces. So thinking about myself being a member of the Latinx faculty staff group and being able to find locations where we have common experiences and can find that community and center in that community and use that as a healing space. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. And I think that whenever we talk about affinity spaces, and I'm big on that at University of Denver, everywhere that I've worked, but I always present it with a caveat of a both and, to say that we need those healing spaces, those affinity spaces, spaces for community, but we can't say that that will be the only thing we do. And sometimes, we default to that. We say, oh man, there's some racism, there's some sexism, there's whatever ism we want to think about in this school, this college, this space, whatever else. We need to lean into supporting the affinity groups or create affinity groups. And then we say, whew, glad we did that. Now they know how to deal with that, because once again, we talk about racism, we talk about all the isms like they just are. It just came out of the sky. We don't know where it came from, and we don't want to own up to the fact that somebody purposefully created that. Some other people, sometimes purposefully, sometimes unknowingly, perpetuated that. So if they've been created and perpetuated, they can be examined, they can be dismantled, they can be reconstructed or transformed into something that is more, the space itself can be healing. So then you still might want to have the affinity space, but it's not as crucial in the moment because you've diffused some of the things that folks are healing from. So we have to think about a both and. We can't, and I'm totally for, particularly in the moment, because it takes time. If we're talking about things that have taken generations to build up, we can't say, well, no, we're not going to have an affinity group because this semester's the semester we're getting rid of racism in college XYZ. It's not gonna happen that quick, y'all. So we have to go through a process, so we do that both and, where we create these spaces of support, spaces of healing. We actually deal with people with an equity lens. We meet people where they are, give them what they need, while we're also thinking through transformation of structures. But it's very hollow if we're not actually engaging in transformation of structures or having that in our trajectory. If we're not working towards it and all we're doing, we could pour all the money we wanted to in affinity groups. But if there's no effort, no time, no energy put into actually addressing the issues that most concern and most hurt the people who are members of those affinity groups, what are we doing? So we really need to have both, and it's my understanding that, this is the path that y'all are on. Y'all are trying to make that happen. So I'm very, happy to engage with y'all and proud of that. Anybody else? Well, thank you. At least we have, I see another hand, all right. I was about to give up.
Hi, my name's Melissa. I teach in the Honors College undergrads, and I think part of it is sort of thinking about kind of pursuing anti-racist practice is as faculty and teaching faculty, being comfortable with being uncomfortable and being authentic about our own identities and processes, and creating space for others to sort of share and learn from each other, and just really have these authentic conversations that are not othering, but that are inclusive, and realizing that we're all kind of on this journey towards trying to create a better and more just society.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. Because when we allow that type of thought process to enter in, we have a whole lot of people who check out. Where they're like, I'm interested in getting engaged, but I don't know enough to be perfect, so I'm not gonna do anything. And then we have people who are trying, and we're trying to tear them down. Now, on the flip side, you have a few people who, they kind of front like they're trying, and they're like, oh, give me some time, it's taking me time. And like, haven't you been saying you were working on this for 10 years? How many books do you need to read? Let's engage. So, we have to find a happy medium there. But I definitely like the idea of recognizing that we're all in different spaces of understanding, different spaces of navigating. But also, we have to create spaces and really, think of accountability in terms of, a lot of times we'll have colleagues who say, I'm all for DEI, I'm all for anti-racism, I'm all for all of this stuff over there. But here, I teach, and they'll name out whatever they teach. It doesn't pertain to me. We don't have any issues. And I'm like, wait a minute. First off, what are the dynamics within your space? What are the dynamics within the professions that you're sending students into? What are the dynamics in terms of the research you have? How does it interact with the rest of our society? There's no thing that is studied at this university or any other university that there's not some type of connection to the ills that we have in society in terms of the people who are practicing it, the professional organizations, the folks within the department, dynamics, the school or college dynamics, the, representation or lack of representation of scholars within those spaces. All of those things that, it's unavoidable. There's different ways to plug in, but we have a lot of that where folks will be like, that's great, I applaud it, keep it going. And then we say, well, what about over there? You need me to come? Oh, no, we're good. We're good. We don't need that. So, don't let folks off the hook. Engage in that accountability. I'm trying to. Okay. Now we've come to another point, okay, where we can think and report out. So with this one for that posted board, and that one. I think, what do we have? It's just, I might be missing one, but I think we have 3 there. For those, please take a moment, to visit and think about putting what first comes to mind when you think about addressing anti-Black racism in your spheres of influence. So take a moment to think about your spheres of influence. It could be your spheres of influence within the office, within your profession, within your scholarly discipline, within the Salt Lake City metro area, within your family, your friend group. We have a lot of different spheres of influence. We are also influenced, but where you interact, how can you interject? Really addressing anti-Black racism. Some of you will be in a space where it's like, I want to engage this group in the pursuit of moving towards being anti-racist. Cool. Others of you will say, well, we just need to identify the fact that there's, anti-racism there, and there's all kind of other spaces between that. So if you would, take a moment, and the folks online, wherever they have you reporting, put it there. But on one of these boards, just put the thought that comes to mind as to how you might be able to do it. And if you need to, if it's like, I would hope most of you would think of University of Utah stuff, but it's also important for us to think beyond that. Because when we come here, like I said, we work here for 8 hours a day, but there's 16 other hours of the day that your colleagues have to navigate. So if there are ways in which you can influence the community to be better, that also could be helpful in this. So if we can report there, and then we have the keep and the don't keep boards over there. So after you kind of, go to one of those, put something there that comes to mind out of what we've been talking about. Is there anything specific, Ashley, or more general things that they've been thinking about throughout the morning for keep and throw away?
No, that's good. So the things that you have written down on your Post-it notes that, if you all want to come to a consensus around what you guys think the best ideas are for, things you want to keep and things you want to throw away, and share those on the boards, because we want to keep those. Again, this is how we're going to be, thinking about how we plug into the work and how we really, really make sure that we are able to transform the U into a place where everyone can belong and thrive. So jot your thoughts down on those 3 Post-it notes about how you recognize and
then that's keep and throw away.
And then keep and throw away over here.
So this one be a little bit quicker, so let's, kind of spread yourselves out. Don't be doing too much elbowing at the Post-it boards and stuff. But we'll try to do it around 5 minutes. It might go a little over if we need time. And then we'll wrap up with the last few minutes. 12:15, we'll roll into, our lunchtime festivities. So go forth.
Right, don't be shy.
Please find time. We're going to have lunch and stuff. The boards will still be here. And then as we're transitioning from this morning session, once we feel like the boards have been filled, then folks can start to hang them up. And then, as the folks come in, if some of you stay or other folks come in for the afternoon, at least they can see, some of the things that have been talked about. And then we can keep the ball rolling and collect more. But once again, thank you all for your input, both on the keep and throw away as well as on the other boards. We only have a few minutes left, but I did want to make sure that we covered a few things, and I kind of send you off into the atmosphere with a little bit of homework. I know that, Mary Ann and everybody else is going to keep y'all busy, but I want to give you a few things to think about, because remember, I started as a professor. So we think about this idea of disrupting anti-Black racism. And one of the first things that we've talked about it, but I thought I'd reiterate it as we start to come to the end, is that we really need to step in and we need to name it. I know you're like, well, didn't you kind of say that? Yeah, I probably did, but I'm saying it in a different way right now. Step in and name it, okay? That's one of the challenges. If you've taken the time to be here with us this morning, I'm assuming that you want to put some energy in there. And we have to have folks stepping in and naming it, and we have to have folks, it's good for black folks to be able to step in and name it, but at the same time, when we have our white colleagues doing it, when we have other colleagues who might not be black stepping in and doing it and naming it, it can be so much more powerful, and it takes a little bit of weight off. And we also, I heard folks talk about, allies. I always like to talk about making that shift from allies or allyship to being accomplices. Ooh. Where it's like, all right, about to rob this bank, you gonna be in the car? Like, if we go down, we all going down together. It's kind of like the same idea of the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. Yep. A mentor is gonna be the person that you can send an email to, you can have a meeting with every 6 months. A sponsor is gonna be somebody who puts their reputation on the line for you in spaces you didn't even know they did it. Right. A sponsor is gonna be somebody, I remember the president of Augustana College when I was there, he told me that he could see me in senior leadership. He told me that he could see me being a university president at some day. So he said, well, let me try to create a space for you to start leaning into some of this DEI leadership you're already doing. Let me get you some funding, let me get you some other things. Let me send you to some ACE Spectrum Aspiring Leaders training. Let me do some other things. When it came time and people started coming to me and saying, oh, wow, you're more than a professor. You could be somebody's vice provost or vice chancellor or vice president. He was the first one being one of my references. He was like, he loved me enough to let me go, shall you say. But he was that sponsor. This is an old white dude, but that's my boy. Like he saw those things. He saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. Where I was just like, oh, I'm on this tenure track. I'm rolling. I'm doing this. And he's like, hey, have you ever thought about this? That's a sponsor. That's different than the mentor who I bring my issues to. They talk to me. And that's a similar difference between an ally and an accomplice. An accomplice is going to be somebody who's willing to take some heat for standing in the breach with you. An accomplice is going to be somebody who looks at their budget and says, oh, we need to engage as anti-racist. We need to work against, anti-black racism. Let's team up. You don't have enough in your space. Let's find some space in my budget. Let me give some of my time. Let me do all of those types of things. So think about that. So really going beyond relationships and aiming for structural transformation. So making sure that we never take our eye off the relationships as that accomplice, as that sponsor, but the actions that we take within the framework of those relationships is towards structural change, is towards systemic progress, as opposed to saying, well, I was really nice to somebody who looks different than me. I feel good, give me my gold star, I'm out of here. Okay, well, you leave, they leave. Does the institution look any different?
Right.
And that's what I'm always talking about at the University of Denver, because University of Denver is very relationship-heavy, policy-light. I think I said it to you all earlier. And I'm like, well, how can we establish structures, systems, create new positions and figure out the ways in which we can create spaces that we're talking about the system, the structure, the program, the position, as opposed to the person that holds it. Because I could get hit by a bus, somebody else could leave, whatever else. And if we've only done things on a relational basis, we're kind of stuck there. So think about ways in which you might want to provide even more feedback. You have this QR code, you have other ways, but we still have these boards up here. We still have lots of ways in which you can engage with different folks. And I really want you all to think about ways in which you can disrupt, what is already happening. The ways in which you can make something look different than the way it did look yesterday. The ways in which you can say, wow, that's something that I had something to do with. There are things that are going on at Augustana College right now that I could say, yep, that was my baby. There are things going on at Creighton University right now that I can say, yep, that's my baby. I'm happy that my colleagues, and I see my colleagues at different conferences and they're like, oh, you created this Union Pacific Diversity Scholars Program, or you created this diversity dissertation program, or you did this and that, and it's changing the structure of the institution and it's staying. What are some of the things that you could do in leaving your mark? Because you could be here for your whole career, but guess what? Your career ends at some point. You got to retire at some point. You might be called elsewhere. You might, all these different things, but what are the ways that you can make your mark? Either collectively or make your mark individually for these things where then you could do better and somebody could say, man, I remember in 2022, they started talking about anti-Black racism at the University of Utah, and now in whatever it's gonna be, it's a destination of choice. It's a place where they're actually able to compete and with a straight face, tell potentially the best of the best Black faculty colleagues or the best of the best Black grad students or the best of the best undergrads or student athletes, whoever it is, this is a place where you can come and thrive as your full and authentic self. As opposed to saying, well, come on out. We got some money, we got some funds, and then you kind of do the shrug and say, well, good luck. You really want to get to that place where you got your chest out. You're like, where are you working? What job are you presenting? University of Utah. And they're like, I heard of y'all. Y'all are doing things. Where do I sign up? So that's what I would leave you with, and I'll pass it to Ashley if she has anything, because I think we are.
Yeah, we're almost at time.
1 minute.
The piece about naming was so key because some of the things that we have often been talking about here at the U are, number one, the power of naming. Again, not about people, but this is about the policies, practices, and programs that need to shift, and this is about calling out acts of hate and bias where we see them. We also think about leading from discomfort. Leading in a place of discomfort, leaning into that. We talked a lot about discomfort today. That's one of the key points of this work, just learning to lean into that discomfort and being okay. The discomfort is not a stop sign, but it's just understanding that it exists and that I still have to work through it. And then the third thing that we often like to think about is how we unearth and replant new roots. So how are we going to take the things that we're gonna stop or throw away to replant something new? So there are several ways that you all can get involved in the work that's already happening. One thing that I think you all can look out for is finding out who are the key people in your departments who are in charge of EDI. How can you plug in with those folks? Two, you might want to identify who are the people in your individual units who are serving on the EDI strategy councils. Who are those folks and how do you plug in with them to make sure your voice is heard? And then third, I might be missing something. Where did Mary Ann go? She may have stepped out. What am I missing, Mary Ann? Yes, so there are quarterly meetings that happen. So we invite everyone to come out to those. So how can you step in and come to those and let your thoughts be heard? Those are the ways that you can get plugged in. I'm sure Mary Ann and others in the EDI division can also offer some other insights. But I think right now we're gonna turn it over to Sheena. We have a break and then lunch and then more amazingness later.
All right, thank you all so much for spending your morning with us. It's been a pleasure getting to hear the conversations at the tables, to see the chat going on online and folks engaging there. So much appreciated. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martell Teasley, who is our interim Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. He stepped into that role and started doing that in just January, but we've had the benefit of his leadership at the University of Utah since 2017, where he has served as the Dean of Social Work and then was named the Associate Provost and Special Assistant to the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. On the national stage, he recently began his second term as President of the National Association of Deans and Directors of Schools of Social Work, and he co-leads the Grand Challenge to Eliminate Racism, which is part of the National Grand Challenges for Social Work Initiative. Please help me welcome Dr. Teasley to the stage.
Thank you so much, and with all that work, I'm going to need a clone. So, I just really want to thank everyone who is here today, who have organized today's events. Could you please stand up for a round of applause? Mary Ann, everyone that has worked with you, could you please just stand up for a moment? And let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Now, the committee asked me to counsel classes today, and I thought about that, but my insurance company told me they could not cover me if professors attacked me, so when class goes on. But let's hope that that may be in the works for the future. I'm going to be short because I know it's lunchtime, so thank you for that introduction. I'm honored to be here with you today. Before we go on, I'd like to thank the President's Commission on Equity and Belonging for planning the events of this day of collective action. Their committee has had a short amount of time, but they pulled it together, and the events of the day will be meaningful. I also want to thank President Randall for his thoughts and considerations of how to stay the course and proactively create a better community within our university and just not put out fires when there are problematic issues. Already, we have had opportunities to discuss anti-Blackness, building inclusive pedagogies at the U, design justice, and other inspiring topics. I hope you'll continue to participate in the other discussions planned this afternoon. I believe this day is an opportunity for reflection for each of us and a way of stepping outside of ourselves and considering others. It is important for each of us to be genuine in our attempts to understand people who are before us and who we come in contact with before we pass judgment upon them. If I could give you one piece of advice, it is get to know people. That is, other people outside of your inner circle and your comfort zones. People who do not look like you, who do not share the same space as you or the same life as you. Get to know them. The university is a rich place with people from all walks of life. While you are here, engage with as many people as you can. That's particularly important for students from different backgrounds. It will enrich your educational experience. This is the minimum that we can do for each other. In fact, we hinder ourselves in our freedom when we do not share and cooperate with each other. Please remember that freedom means cooperation, and we cannot do so unless we know each other. No matter who we are, or what we become, or what we achieve in life, we should always remember to be kind to people because it is people who make us who we are. And I really, truly mean that. This day of collective action is a day of consideration and reflection, but there are 364 other days within the calendar year which we should continue this dialogue to create the type of university and society that we all want to live in. So I challenge you to take the lessons and insights you've gained on this day of collective action, and bring them forward to other people and continue to dialogue. Get to know other people. Get outside of your comfort zone, as our speaker talked about. Let's keep the dialogue going. Thank you so much for your time. And now you have the opportunity to work and talk with each other. So please enjoy your lunch. Thank you.